Okay.
Taylor, my name is Radigonda. I'm a docent on the USS Hornet. We're standing at Hangar Bay 3. I've been working here now for about 11 years. I served aboard the USS Radigonda. Working on the flight deck. This was a sister ship to the Hornet in the 50s. It became apparent to me on the ship that there needed to be an exhibit that showcased all of the airplanes that ever flew off the ship, starting from 1941 on up to 1970. The first Hornet, number 8, was sunk in October 1942. This ship was being built at that time. It was going to have a different name, and then the name was changed to Hornet after. So what we have here on this display in this mural are all the aircraft and helicopters that ever flew from the ship. In order for you to get the proper sizing and so forth, I picked the largest airplane, which was the A.J. Savage, which was an atomic bomber that was used in the early 50s. Turned out it was not too great of an airplane, but that was the biggest airplane that would have flown. So by getting the size of that airplane and then looking up the size of all the rest of the airplanes, I was able to come up with an inch or foot type of situation where I designed each one. I had to hand draw each airplane because if you try to use photography, it's going to be distorted. So I had to hand draw each airplane and make templates of that. Once I had built the wall and then the background of the water and the clouds, the sequence of all the planes in the years that they flew, I take them up there and then paint them into each plane. Looking at here, the first row would be the airplanes that flew off the number 8 Hornet, which was discussed in the summer after October 1942. The top airplane was already phased out before Pearl Harbor, and we figured out the airplane of that style just wasn't going to make it. The airplanes were coming down the pipe. The second airplane, the Wildcat, was a great airplane for us, especially flying out of Guadalcanal and the Marines also. It really helped us at the beginning of the war up against the Japanese Zero. Very maneuverable. It couldn't do what the Zero could do because the Zero was much lighter, but it did work out pretty well. The third plane is the Douglas Dauntless, which basically saved our hide at the Battle of Midway that sunk the 3 Japanese carriers in just a few minutes. The thing about that airplane was, like other dive bombers, had a tail gunner riding backwards, and when that airplane went into a dive down to drop the bombs on the ships, that man was looking almost straight up into the air, like airplanes chasing them to try and shoot him down. What I always thought was there must be a stop on that machine gun to keep the gunner in this haste to be shooting and not shooting with the tail of the airplane. But I found out, talking to a tail gunner that was actually at the Battle of Midway, that there was no stop. So some of those airplanes came back with the tail shot off, but the pilots weren't too upset, especially if you shot down an enemy aircraft. Next one down is the Devastator, which is in the livery of Torpedo Squadron 8, which was in the Battle of Midway, and it was a real poor situation. 15 of those airplanes took off with a squadron, each carrying 2 men. And all of the airplanes were shot down. One man survived, the pilot of one airplane, George Gay, did survive it. All the other planes and all the other personnel were involved. And the bottom airplane is an Army bomber, a B-25, and this represented here because it was the airplanes that Jimmy Doolittle flew when they attacked Japan in April of 1942. And there was no airplane that had ever been off of an aircraft carrier, and that was what was so significant about the fact that they did do it. All 16 airplanes got off.
Okay, wherever you start, you're good, Rich.
The next row of planes we have here represents our real firepower that we had beginning in World War II. The top airplane there, very popular. Almost everybody knows what a Corsair was. They were a very fast airplane with the bent wings. Pappy Boyington made a very famous flying with Marine Squadron VMF 214 out of Guadalcanal, but they did fly a lot off the carriers after they finally got it figured out how to fix the landing gear, because when the planes were coming aboard, they were bouncing too much, and they had to repair that. Once they got that going, the Corsair really was a great airplane. The next airplane also flew off the Hornet. The Bearcat arrived too late to fly in World War II. It was a very fast aircraft, but it became operational right at the end of the war, around August of 1945, so it never really got to see any combat. And then by the time the Korean War came 5 years later, the jets had already taken over, so the Bearcat, the very fast airplane, never really got in any combat. It did become a great airplane though at the Reno Air Race just because it was so fast later on. Next airplane down is the Hellcat, which a lot of people don't realize shot down many more airplanes than the Corsair. The Corsair shot down about 1,500 enemy aircraft. The Hellcat shot down over 5,000. They were a very sturdy airplane, and pilots really loved them. They weren't as fast as the Corsair, and they weren't as sexy looking, I guess would be the word, but they were very operational. Could take a lot of punishment. The dive bomber, Curtis Helldiver, came about 1943 and kind of took over from the Dauntless, and it also helped out a lot. It was also used as a high-level bomber. By about 1944, they had figured out that torpedo bombers weren't the best way to go, because a torpedo bomber coming in had to fly at a straight level line at about 50 feet over the ocean and try and torpedo a ship and line up. You couldn't wait from that, so they were kind of sitting ducks at that type of situation. And little by little, they were phased out and used more as bombers. Next plane below it was a very famous plane, the Avenger, also a torpedo bomber, sturdier, faster, but it also then became a high-level bomber. When I say high-level, they were bombing from 1,000, 2,000 feet instead of being right on the ocean level floor. Some of these airplanes that are represented in here, 6 of them took off from the ship and never returned. They were lost in combat. Bottom airplane, the AG Sky Raider, came along right after the war was over, after World War II was over, and was used quite a bit in Korea, and also actually used in Vietnam. Its designation eventually went to the A1, and it had a nickname of Sandy, and the Air Force used it also, and the Navy. Moving along to the jets that came along all in the 50s, this next row represents that. The top airplane, the A4 Skyhawk, was really designed as an atomic bomber, if you can believe that, a single engine, single pilot aircraft. And it was designed to bring an atomic bomb in externally. It could fly at 600 knots at 50 feet above the ocean, and it could come in under radar. And when it was 2 miles from the target, it would pull up and actually release the bomb. The bomb would fly to the target 2 miles away. The airplane would do a reverse and go back. The theory was it was going to outrun the blast of the bomb. It was not going to do that. It was a suicide mission. But it was our first line of defense if we were attacked by the Russians to go into their cities. That's why these carriers, in those days, the Essex-class carriers, were staying off of northern Japan constantly to be ready ready in case that happened, that they could fly in and bomb certain cities that are close to the coastline. Next plane down, the 00 there, was the FJ Fury. It was the Navy version of the F-86 Saberjet. It was so popular in Korea. It flew as a fighter plane. It had the tail hook, of course, and stronger frame and wings that would fold so that it could operate off of an aircraft carrier. We call it, when I worked on the ship, we called it the world's biggest vacuum cleaner. Because with that intake that it had when it was on the catapult, if you were not careful and you slipped in front of it when that thing was ready to go down the cat, it could actually suck you up, pull you right off the ground, and pull you right into the aircraft, into the intake of the aircraft, which I did observe that happen 2 times. The Banshee jet was a good fighter plane that we had that flew in the Korean War. It was one of the first ones to shoot down the big communist big fighter planes. It was developed actually right after the war was over, after World War II was over, and it did a good job in the Korean War. After the Korean War, it became what they call the photo op plane, mounted with cameras. It had a very stable platform to do a lot of aerial photography, all the way up to the Vietnam War. Panther jet, very popular fighter plane also. These were the first 2 airplanes that were used in the Korean War as Navy jets, and they were made a real problem for the aircraft carriers because they were 50 miles an hour faster on landing speed than a propeller plane were. So a lot of options had to change in the 50s for these aircraft carriers to handle jet fighter craft. The Panther jet was very popular, and it was showcased quite a bit in the movie Bridges at Tokyo-ri with Grace Kelly and William Holden. That was the airplane that was flying in that movie, and most of that movie was made off of footage from the USS Hornet, which was also the same class here as the Hornet. Bottom airplane I discussed a little bit already, the A.J. Savage. It had 2 propeller internal combustion engines and a jet in the tail. It was designed to carry an atomic bomb, and it was the biggest airplane that could fly off of the Hornet. The Hornet never had its catapults upgraded to steam catapults. It still had hydraulic catapults. This was the biggest airplane that it could launch. There was a lot of problems with the AJ through the 2 years that it was in the fleet, with crashing and so forth, and they finally had to just give up on it.
Okay.
Took a break.
Okay, we're good, yeah.
Ready? Talking about the helicopter at the top, the Hub 2, that helicopter was used a lot in the 50s. It would take off just before the airplanes would take off. It would fly alongside the ship, and it was ready to pick up anybody that got blown off the deck by jet blast or prop blast, and that happened more than a few times. And also if a pilot went, if an airplane went in the water close by, the helicopter was there to pick up and rescue. Later on, other helicopters came along that could do the job better, but in the 50s, right up until about 62, that helicopter was our best helicopter they had working off the ships. The next airplane down was called the Skyray, and it was one of the first aircraft designed with no tail, a tailless airplane. It was our first airplane that could go faster than the speed of sound that the Navy had. It did not last long in the fleet though. They had too many problems. So it was only around for about 2 years again. What was happening in those later years in the 50s were trying to figure out what the Russians had and what we had, and airplanes were coming into the fleet that did not serve properly. One that was really bad that we do not have up here, the Cutlass they just never were able to get it right. The landing gears kept collapsing. There was all kinds of problems with this until they finally got it right. The next airplane is the Cougar, which was a same designation as the Panther, F9F, but this was up to F9F5, and this turned into F9F6, and it was the same version of the airplane but with swept wings. As you can see, a little bit faster airplane. It eventually also became a photo plane in the later 50s because it carried a lot of the cameras up in the front areas here, and it worked out good. It did get into some combat in the Korean War, but pretty much was developed almost right near the end. The last row of planes and helicopters you see here, all were now used when the ship became a CVS designation. It was a CVA, which meant it was an attack aircraft carrier. When it went to the CVS designation, it meant that it was an anti-submarine carrier and was carrying all of the equipment and aircraft that could search out submarines because we're always worried about the Russian threat. These aircraft carried what was called a sonobuoy, which was a tube, basically a tube about 6 feet long, about 6 inches in diameter. It could be dropped in the water if there was a chance that there was a sub in that area. It could be dropped in the water, and about 2/3 of it floated under the water, and 1/3 of it was above the water, and it could pick up the sounds by sonar in the sub and relay it back to the airplane. The airplane could carry some weapons, torpedoes, and bombs, and so forth. If it could not get to the sub itself, they could call it another sub or a destroyer. The aircraft also, the second aircraft here, also was used then as an airplane that could bring people aboard the carriers and also brought mail aboard the carriers. When you were aboard one of these things and you saw that TF, as we called it, coming, you knew mail was coming. It was always a happy occasion. The helicopters, the last three that we're looking at here, the helicopters, this one was an attack helicopter. This could carry all kinds of weapons and was used quite a bit in Vietnam. This helicopter is actually in the livery of the helicopter that picked up the Apollo 11 crew members when they came back from the moon. The number 66, of which we have a version of it here on the ship. The bottom helicopter was a troop helicopter that was used a lot in Korea and in Vietnam to actually bring Marines into a battle zone. So what we've gone through here is all of the aircraft that came off the Hornet, and the whole mural is painted. The airplanes are all painted in oil paint on a background. The background is all in latex paint, but we're painting the planes in oil to be able to get a little sharper image. What was fun to do in some of the situations was to put, like on the Hellcat, I've got a guy smoking a cigarette, which they did a lot of. The thing about it also was that a lot of these airplanes, as you can see, they had the cockpits open quite a bit when they were flying them. So it was kind of fun to paint those because you're able to show the pilot more humanly. Whereas with the jets, you just put an oxygen mask on them and a crash helmet and close the canopy down. So that was interesting to do. But this plane, as I talked about, the whole squadron was lost. This number is the plane that George Gay was flying. He was the only survivor. The plane didn't survive, but he did. The B-25, these two planes never came back after they launched. The Avenger was lost in battle. We had some of the family here of the pilot one day talking to us about it. We got some more history on the airplane. The AD number 512 was lost in battle. The FJ00 was lost in the battle, and the number 12 S2F was lost in a battle. I had a lot of time in those flying when I was still in high school. I had joined the Navy in November of 1955, the Navy Reserve, and so we used to go one weekend a month to Oakland Airport. At that time, there was a Naval Air Reserve unit there, and it was always fun because when you went there on a weekend, you got to fly because the pilots were getting in their hours. You got to fly on a Saturday night, go back to school on Monday morning. Somebody was bragging about taking out the pretty girls to the dances on Saturday night. You got to tell them, well, I was flying in a Navy bomber. I don't know what the trade-off was there, but it was always something pretty cool to be able to say that.
How many hours does this take you to do?
This whole project, from the start to the end, was approximately 1,000 hours. The frame itself is built out of 2x3 studded wall. I built all of those on the elevator right behind us here, and then put them up. There's a metal frame back there, and we bolted up each 4x10 set studs. And then once I had that all up and balanced, then we put these special panels up that are made for this type of a project. They're plywood with a paper finish on them that's made for sign painting. And what was interesting was when I was putting up the walls and bolting everything in, I knew that I had everything perfectly square on the ground. But when I was putting it up there and bolting everything together, I had to keep shimming stuff, and I couldn't figure out what was going on until one of the engineers came by and had to remind me that the ship's not perfectly straight. So losing the word here. The intensity that I had to figure out everything to be so accurate took a lot of work before the mural was ever up there, in order to have everything be as accurate as I possibly could by size and by perspective and by markings. It took a lot of reading and studying pictures and so forth of the different aircraft and the numbers that they had on them to be able to be as accurate as possible. When you're taking on something like this, you want to make sure that you've got it as perfect as you can, because there's going to be somebody coming along that was in one of those squadrons that's going to say, hey, well, wait a minute, you missed something here. So.
Okay, very good. Okay, go ahead, Rich.
Okay, so we're here again on the USS Hornet and down what is called the wardroom area, which is where the officers actually ate their meals. This room was a side room to the wardroom, where they had a recreation room in here. In 2011, it was the 100th anniversary of the first time an airplane had ever landed on a ship. And there was events going on all over the United States commemorating that with the Navy. And so I talked with the people here at the Hornet, and I decided I wanted to really do some kind of a exhibit here. So the first thing that I needed to do was find the airplane, or the model of the airplane. Well, that turned out that wasn't going to be so easy, so I decided I was going to build the airplane. And I found the plans at the Cleveland Model Company, which used to make airplane kits but just sells plans now. They're back in Indiana. And I got the plans for a 1/8 scale, to build a 1/8 scale model of the Curtiss Pusher aircraft. So I built the airplane first, scratch built it. The plane you're looking at represents that plane that made the first landing. Everything on this model is handmade except for the wheels. The wheels are commercially made. But everything else, including the pilot, is all carved, or pieces are made and so forth to put it together. Once I had the airplane built and I knew the size and so forth, I was able to do the inch to foot scale and figure out the rest of the program. Now, what they had done in 1911 was to take a battle cruiser, which is represented here in the background of the painting, In those days, they were called battle cruisers instead of battleships. And what they did on the back part of the ship was to take one of these ships, the USS Pennsylvania, up to Mare Island Shipyard in Vallejo, and build a 100-foot long flight deck on the back there that this airplane could possibly land on. So once the scale was done, that I had it all figured out, I was able to figure out how long the flight deck needed to be in the exhibit. So we started out with an airplane that was built, and everything else I had to figure out to that scale. I built the wall in the background first. It's 40 feet long and 7 feet high, and it represents San Francisco in 1911, 5 years after the earthquake. So there was a lot of research done on that to make sure that I was as accurate as possible. And in the mural are certain objects that from history that have survived through the years. We've got the ferry building, the Presidio, and Fort Point, which right now exists underneath the base of the Golden Gate Bridge. Everything else is sort of as the city was building up after the earthquake. So the story goes that Glenn Curtiss, who was building aircraft in those days, he was also building engines for his aircraft. He was working for the Navy building seaplanes because he thought in those days, that the future of any naval aviation was going to be seaplanes only. So when it was decided to try and land an airplane on a ship, he wasn't even interested in it. He didn't even come up to watch it. He had one of his pilots come to fly the plane on and see what was going to happen. The plane took off from what's now Tanforan Shopping Center down in San Bruno. At that time, in 1911, there was a racetrack there. It took off and flew up the bay near Brisbane, around Candlestick Point, where the 49ers and the Giants used to play, and down the bay, and the USS Pennsylvania was anchored in the bay in a strong incoming tide. This had all been figured out beforehand, and it was in the winter time where we get a lot of east winds with fog, and so the plane came down, and about 50 feet from where the ship was, he cut the motor and drifted onto the deck. What they had there was ropes across the deck that were tied to Navy sea bags filled with sand, and the hook to catch the wire was a butcher's beat hook. The man that was flying the airplane, his name was Eugene Ely, and his friend was a butcher, and he'd given him the hook, and they bolted it into the bottom of the airplane. The engine, designed and built by Glenn Curtiss, was a 50 horsepower V8 engine. It was gravity fed. The carburetor was gravity fed. The fuel tank was right above his head there on the right side of him. The radiator is right at his back, so if you ever punched a hole in it, you're going to get scalded. The problem with these type of aircraft that we hadn't figured it out yet, the engine behind the pilot, there were several crashes in those years, and even though the crash might not be that bad, the engine came loose and would crush the pilot. So they finally figured out after 1911 that they needed to go the tractor idea with the engine in the front. This aircraft and its design and so forth would have never had a very good chance against the Red Baron only a few years later in World War I. Real high-tech stuff for controls. He had a steering wheel that actually could fly the plane with. His right foot was on a gas pedal. It was not a hand throttle. He had a foot pedal just like a car does. And his left foot was on a brake, and the brake was basically a pedal that had a wooden dowel attached to it that rubbed against the front wheel. The flight deck on the ship was built at an upward angle so that when he hit the deck, he'd be rolling uphill to come to a stop. And everybody in the bay and all the ships around, as you can see in the mural, was waiting to see what was going on. And of course, the sailors were all backed up to watch this. That was all put into the painting. The photographer that I've got there, actually, all of those fellows that were on the deck sticking their heads up, is if you see accurate pictures of it, when he came into land, they were exactly in those positions. I like to paint ducks also, so I had to put a few ducks in the picture. But this is a representative of the 100th anniversary of the first time an airplane landed on a ship. Now, the admirals were very upset about this because the flight deck was covering up the rear gun on the ship, and they couldn't figure out how you were going to be in a battle if you couldn't shoot that rear gun. The Japanese and the British both realized what they were looking at, and the British actually had an operating aircraft carrier in World War I. The Japanese were building aircraft carriers, and we did not know about that. It wasn't until 1925 that America had its first aircraft carrier, which was very small, but then in 1927-28 they came with the Lexington and the Saratoga, which were very large aircraft carriers, and finally we started to get into the program as to what was going on. As soon as this event was over, they took the ship back up to Mare Island and took the flight deck back off and established it back as a battle cruiser.
So how long did this take you to build this here, Rich?
This project is about 450 hours of volunteer time to put this all together, figuring out the sizes and so forth. The first project obviously was to build the airplane. Once the airplane was done, then everything else just sort of fell into place.
And you got those ducks in there.
Had to have some ducks in there. I mean, the wildlife that was in the bay at that time must have been phenomenal. The other thing is that people have looked at this and they said, well, geez, you know, you got the wind going the wrong way, but it actually was an east wind, and he did land in a tailwind. That way there, after he had lunch with the captain, they removed all of the ropes off the deck, they turned the airplane around, and he took back off. So it was the first takeoff, and so he rolled downhill a little bit when he went to take off, and got all the way back to Tanforan again. It was quite a feat. The guy was a real daredevil. He was killed about 4 months later in a demonstration back east. A very, very smart man that was flying the airplane, a very skilled man. It was a real shame to lose him.
So that was the arresting gear,
This is the
sandbags.
resting gear, and they had those two main wooden barriers going up the center of the deck to hold the ropes up a little bit so that the hook would catch them. It's amazing that later on the idea stuck, and it was used on all the carriers. Now it keeps the cables up. They're using small bridges of stainless steel that holds it up just a little bit. That when the airplane rolls over it, they can go back down, but it would hold, it catches the hook as it's going along. Bicycle inner tubes that are inflated because Ely could not swim, and he was afraid if he went in the water he was going to drown, so he had those bicycle inner tubes wrapped around his body. Also on the plane, showing on the plane underneath the pilot there, you see tanks. They kind of look like bombs, but they were air tanks in case the airplane went in the water, that it would float. And also the whole aircraft was built of bamboo, a very strong product. I couldn't use bamboo in the model, so what I did was to try and paint them the best I could to look like bamboo. Also, thing I forgot here, Curtis was the first one to develop this. The Wright brothers had a complete monopoly on aircraft in the years when they after they first flew in the 03, 04, and 05, and so forth. In order for the airplane to turn, they actually used to bend the wings. They had levers that they could actually bend the wings to make the airplane turn, besides the rudder and the stabilizer. And you could not build an airplane unless the Wright brothers said so, because they had a patent on all airplanes. So Curtiss figured he'd get around that by building an airplane that had ailerons. So he built the first airplanes that actually had ailerons, which are obviously still used today in all aircraft to be able to turn the plane. And it didn't work too well. The Wright brothers sued him, and they both went through spending way too much money through the teens to try and get that all resolved. What it finally ended up happening was Wilbur Wright had died, and Orville and Glenn Curtiss solved this problem by becoming the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, which was then building engines for our aircraft in World War II, and the company is still around. But this airplane was the first one to use ailerons in America. I think that they were already, working at it in Europe also.
All right. Looking good. See. So we'll go over to the catapult here, Rick.
Yeah.
Okay.
Say when?
Anytime.
Okay, we're on the flight deck of the USS Hornet. This ship operated up until 1970. We're standing on the port catapult, left side. The method of launching an aircraft nowadays is different. The catapults work obviously the same way, but the actual hookup of the airplane when it's going to be launched is quite a bit different. Now, these catapults are from World War II. They're hydraulic. They could only build up so much pressure. Consequently, heavier airplanes that were coming along in the 50s could not be launched. Other carriers were converted to steam catapults. All carriers nowadays are with steam. They can build up a lot more pressure and launch heavier aircraft. When an airplane came onto the catapult in the 50s, the jet fighters of those years did not have nose wheel steering. So in order to get the airplanes on the catapults quickly, because on a carrier with steam catch, you were launching an aircraft off each catapult. You had one on the port side, one on the starboard side. You're launching an aircraft off each catapult every 30 seconds. In order to get those airplanes on the catapults quickly, you hooked a bar to the nose wheel of the airplane, and as the plane was coming onto the cat, this blast deflector would go down. The airplane would be brought on, and you held onto that bar, and you ran backwards with that bar in your hand with two guys running with you. If you fell down, they picked you up, threw you out of the way, picked up the bar, and kept going to get that airplane onto the cat. So you steered that airplane on. It better be on straight, because if it wasn't on perfectly straight to go down the cat, if it was off crooked, that meant the whole crew of guys had to come and push the airplane back and then do it again. And you lost some time, and in a wartime situation, that wasn't going to work. Plus, the chief petty officer up here, the flight deck chief, had a very large boot, and he was going to place it somewhere where it hurt, so he just didn't want that to happen. The guy that had the most interesting job here was a green shirt, worked on the catapult. As the airplane was coming onto the cat, he would be laying on his back underneath the airplane, passing him up. And he would hook this cable into the bottom of the airplane as it passed him. There was a small piece that was designed to break when the catapult fired, and he'd hook it up into that airplane. That cable would come taut, and then in the front part of the cat, where the shuttle is, here then a bridle would hook up to the airplane, and those two things would come tight, and that would hold the airplane in place. The pilot would go to 100% power. If everything was working right, he'd give a salute. Flight deck officer, the catapult officer, would give the signal to fire, and bang, that thing would go, that piece in the back called the holdback would snap. It was designed to snap. The airplane would go down the catapult's 200 feet long, takes you from 0 to 130 miles an hour in 2 seconds. As it was going down the the blast deflector would go down. The next airplane was right in line to come out to go on. The fellow would then be rolling back underneath. Here where the airplane was passing over, he'd grab that cable, he'd take the broken piece out, throw it over the side, shove a new one in. By then the next airplane was coming back over him. He would reach up and put it in there. His timing had to be impeccable. Each side was doing that. There was an awful lot of activity up here. It is hard to explain the amount of noise that you were listening to. Usually about 35 airplanes on the flight deck all at the same time running. In those days you had propeller-driven airplanes and jets both. The noise was excruciating. That's why I have to say what a lot nowadays. But it was quite something. Although I would have never traded. Being up here was fantastic. I would have never traded it for being below decks. Now, if you're looking up the deck here, you see this yellow square. That's the #1 elevator. If you had an airplane on the catapult and the pilot realized there was something wrong with the airplane, with his airplane, it wasn't going to fly, he'd have to give a thumbs down, and they would just taxi that airplane onto the #1 elevator and drop it down onto the way so it didn't get in the way of the rest of the airplanes coming up the deck. Airplanes could actually, with the elevator in the down position, airplanes could actually launch anyway. There were just enough room down either side for them to go. These little squares that you see in the deck were the hold downs, that when the planes were not flying, cables or chains would hold the plane in place when it went flying. They also saved a lot of guys' lives who would, if they were hit by a jet blast or a prop blast, they'd lay flat on the deck, stick your fingers in there and hold on tight till the airplane passed you up. So they weren't designed for that, but they helped out a lot.
Okay, you're on.
What we're looking at now is your resting gear area, the aft part of the flight deck. These stanchions that are sticking up here where the cables ran across the deck. On this carrier there was 5 cables. This is basically the idea that you saw on that 100th anniversary display where they were holding the rope for sand tags. Here you had spools with cables that were hydraulically operated. As the cable, if the airplane caught the cable as it was running out, it would stop the airplane at about 130 feet through hydraulic pressure. Basically worked the same as a fishing reel drag. As it went out, it got tighter till it brought it to a stop. You don't want to stop the airplane too fast because it pull a tail hook out of the airplane or it might pull the eyeballs out of the pilot. So you had to do it at each airplane coming in, depending on the weight of the airplane, the type of airplane it was, the hydraulic system had to be set for that so that it would stop that airplane at about 130 feet. So as the airplane came aboard, in those days, in the 50s, any cable caught was a good landing. Nowadays, as I understand it, on the new carriers that are actually much bigger, they've only got 3 cables, and usually they're real happy if you catch the #2 cable in the middle. I understand, so it's become much more sophisticated. Besides that, we never had instrument landings in the 50s, where nowadays I understand that is going on also. So as you're looking up the deck, here you see the landing area. As the pilots were coming in to land, they came in at about 75% power with the jets. As soon as their wheels hit the flight deck, they'd go to 100% power. If the hook missed the cable, they just were positioned to take right back off again. If the hook caught the cable, they were brought to a stop in about 130 feet. The cable could override the power of the aircraft. Now, if you had an airplane coming aboard that had an emergency, that the pilot would radio in landing gear is not working, so forth. And in the 50s, we were just starting to use missiles, and many times aircraft would leave with missiles to go to the firing ranges to practice, and the missiles wouldn't fire. So that meant they had to come back aboard with a live missile on the aircraft. And you knew as soon as it hit the deck, that missile was going to come off the airplane. So they would always holler, "Rig the barricade." And the barricade, see the stanchion sticking up in the air here, that was always in the down position. But there was one on either side of the deck, and you would hook a nylon fence across that when it was in the down position. It would usually take us a little bit over 1 minute to drag that across the deck and hook it up. Then that came up, and the airplane would fly into that, and it was also hooked to one of the arresting cables. It would wrap around the airplane and bring it to a stop. So if the missile, not if, when the missile came off, and the missile would go down the deck, it was separated from the airplane, and you got rid of as much of the problem as you possibly could. Most of the time, that missile would go off the angled deck, and nobody would get hurt. But sometimes that missile would take a bounce and end up going straight down the deck where all the crew was and the airplanes that had landed. So they used to give us a break and let us stand a little further off to the side than you normally would. Walk up the deck here a little further. Talk a little bit about the actual landing when the planes were coming into land, and you had people standing along this line here. This is called the foul line. It goes all the way down the deck. Theoretically, anything that was on this side of that foul line was in the safe zone during landing. That's really having a lot of confidence in what's going on. So when the airplane came aboard, we need to go further up. Okay, from about this position, when the airplanes were coming aboard, you stood on this side. You had about 10 people all standing in this area here. A guy in the hot seat, crash crew people, the director in the yellow shirt, some tractor drivers, everything that you needed in case there was some kind of a crash that happened. And so everybody stood on this side of the line, and you got to think of it now that the ship was always going, keeping 30 knots of wind across the deck. That was safe flying speed. So you're all 19 years old, and you're all leaning into this 30-knot wind, and you're all trying to act really macho while you're watching this airplane coming at you at about 130 miles an hour, and it's only right there. So as the planes were coming in, you'd watch everybody, and they're standing there watching the plane, and just before the airplane's going to hit the deck, it's going to come down. You're not sure if something's going to fall off the plane. Everybody would go like this, lean over like this, ready to exit left. And if the plane hit the deck and nothing came off, everybody came back up straight again. And it was always something to watch that, and I actually caught it on a video one time when it was happening. So you're watching this, and if you're a yellow shirt, which I did do that job, you saw that plane hit the deck. If you saw the hook go in the cable, you were already running out onto the deck as the airplane's coming up the deck. And it comes to a stop about right here, and you're giving the pilot brakes. Hold up, hold, hold. Fold your wings, put your hook up, and come on, get out of here. Go. his tail has to cross that line heading up the deck. Tail had to cross that line because if he's not across that line, it means it's a foul deck. Next airplane can't land. That tail's crossing that line, the next set of wheels hits the deck, 35 seconds. That's how fast airplanes are landing as they're coming in. Planes are taxiing forward, they're going up the deck, and parking the airplanes across the deck, 4 wide, 4 wide, 4 wide, 4 wide. So finally all the airplanes are down from that flight, about 35 airplanes at land. Finally got airplanes stacked all the way back to here, but always on that side of the foul line, and the deck is now, everything's done. As soon as that last airplane hit the deck, it comes to a stop, 8 to 10 tractors would come out, start hooking up airplanes, and we're all forward, bringing everything back, get ready for the next launch. Within about 20 minutes, you could respot 35 airplanes all back into their starting positions again, new pilots climbing in them, and go again. That was going on sometimes 3 or 4 days at the time, no stopping. During the Cold War in the 50s, the way these ships were operating, you never really knew what was coming at you. In many cases, pilots were climbing in the airplanes, fully loaded up, bombed up, ready to go, sitting in the aircraft for 2 hours, climb out with relief, somebody else would climb in, that would go around the clock. The people on the flight deck got a little bit of a break. We didn't leave. It was cold off of northern Japan. Being that we were on a carrier that had steam catapults, you actually could lay down on the top of the catapult and kept you warm. It was another way to get around it. That gives you an idea of what was going on here when the ship was respotting the deck for those 20 minutes to a half an hour. It would turn around and go downwind, so it would give the guys on the deck a little bit of a break from the wind across the deck all the time. Once the pilots were in the plane and the carrier then would start to turn around and go back into the wind again, the propeller-driven airplanes would already be starting up to warm up. Everybody would be climbing into the airplanes, and you had to be ready because all these propellers running, everything going as the airplanes were starting to taxi up the deck. There was so much noise that when they were launching jets forward here where we just were, just further up the deck, there was so much noise from here, from the propeller-driven airplanes, you could not hear those airplanes taking off. If you can imagine a jet only a couple hundred feet away from you, you couldn't hear it because you had so much noise right here. So there was always hand signals only as to what was going on to let you know what was transpiring next, so you would be ready to, as that propeller-driven plane went past you, the prop blast was going to blow you right in to the next airplane coming up. So you had to be really able to scamper underneath, and sometimes you were pulling chocks, all different types of stuff like that. It was a choreographed thing that was happening, and you better make sure you knew what was happening and always watching out for your buddy because you could get hurt really fast.
Okay, so now we're going to go in the flight room.
Yes, we're going to flight deck control now.
Okay, so now why don't you tell us a little bit about that before we go into this?
What's that now?
Tell me a little bit about the flight room. Say something about it, and then we're going to head in there.
Okay.
Okay.
The whole thing that made this all work so good, the system, was developed in 1950. It's still used today. They did try to use computers and stuff, as I understand, in flight deck control, and they've gone back to basically doing it all handled because the computers were just not keeping up with it. So we'll head into flight deck control now, where we have what's called the Ouija board, which is a perfect model of the flight deck and the hangar deck, and show you exactly how that all worked out.
Okay.
Is that the little paper?
Okay, so you can talk about it now. Here's where the flight room is.
Okay, here we are at the flight deck control, which was at the forward part of what's called the island, the main part of the ship sticking out of the deck. This room was filled involved with people from the different squadrons. Pilots usually weren't in here. It was all the people that were handling the airplanes on the deck. The flight deck control officer was in there. The aircraft handling officer was in there. And several other people that all were getting their information on where the airplanes were going to be positioned and what the next flight was going to be about and so forth like that. So we'll be looking at that next.
Okay. Okay, you want to go over here, huh?
I gotta sit down for a minute.
It says women are not
I hear
assigned.
you. Okay, go ahead.
Here we are in what's called flight deck control. Now, when I first came aboard here as a docent, the ship had come out of mothballs a few years before and it had become a museum. This room was basically filled with filing cabinets, and nobody really knew much about the room, what to do with it. What was lucky was the table was still here, that it originally had the original display on it. So by getting some sheet metal and finding the plans of the deck and so forth, so I had the right inch to foot type of thing, I hand drew the flight deck and the hangar deck and painted it with a striping brush, and then made the model planes to the same scale. And I only have 35 airplanes represented here between the flight deck and the hangar deck right now at this point. But actually, in the 50s, a carrier of this type was carrying 85 airplanes. So you can imagine, you put another 50 airplanes on here, how everything was very, very tight. What was happening in this room was what made it so possible for the ship to be able to operate at such a perfect choreography. And what you had was a man standing back here like I am. I did this job for about 4 months. You had sound-powered phones on, and on the other end of those lines was 15 people stationed all over the ship. You had a guy at #1 elevator, you had a guy at catapult, you had a guy at #2 elevator, on and on and on, all up on the flight deck. Same thing on the hangar deck. Every time an airplane moved, any aircraft moving, it was immediately told to you, whether it moved 5 feet or 30 feet or whatever it did. Let's say number 510 is moving across the #1 arresting gear wire. You moved it. You were told that that's where it was, you moved it. Number 00 is ready to go to be airborne. It fired down the cat. 00 is airborne. You took it off the deck and put it over here out of the way for a while till it came back and landed. So pretty soon this whole thing was empty. And the next thing you know, airplanes were coming back aboard. As each airplane landed, that number corresponding with your pile of airplanes here, you put it back up on the deck, and as it taxied up the deck and went all the way forward to where it was going to park until the landing was over, each airplane was put in that position. So with all those people around the deck, the flight deck officer could run in here at any time and know instantly where any certain airplane was. It was, as I stated before, the system started in 1950 and it is still used today. This picture up here on the board here in the middle, that shows a certain 19-year-old, yours truly, on the phones there. and there's probably 8 people talking to me all at the same time. And the fellow, it looks like he's got a white shirt on, it's actually yellow, is the flight deck officer. And he's in here, and you can see there's other people in the room. The room usually had anywhere between 10 and 12 people in it at all times, all finding out what was happening and so forth. And then you had all those people talking to you on the phones. So you were very busy. You had people all the time. There was something going on. Your concentration had to be at the absolute upper limit, always. So this deck represents to scale exactly how big the ship was and how these airplanes took up space. Some of the airplanes that are on here are depicted with the wings open, and also depicted with the wings folded. So you had both types of planes there that you had to. If there was some, most of the time everything was folded, but once in a while you might have an airplane that something was wrong with the wing folding operation, and you'd have to have an airplane that you could put out there that showed that, so that you knew what was going on. What is happening here in this position that I have it right now shows you what would have been a typical launch pattern. The fighter planes would go first, each one up on the flight catapults ready to go, and as each one fired, as I said, you took it off the deck and put it in piles along there, according to the type of aircraft that it was. Once those airplanes are gone, the A4s would then taxi out of position and come on up. They would all be catapulted and go. The last airplanes to come up then up the deck would have been the propeller-driven airplanes. And in those days, the propeller-driven airplanes did not need to be catapulted. They could taxi up to about right outside the door here, which is halfway up the deck, and under their own power, they would go one at a time and take off, and they would be off the deck way before they got to the end of the deck. Now at nighttime, we were catapulting the propeller-driven airplanes also because they couldn't see the deck good, so they would then be on the catapult. But otherwise, they were always just going up under their own power. Now, one of the things that I've done on this deck here, just so that people could see what was going on, this aircraft that I'm going to move here, this, by the way, your hands were always moving like this all the time. That's where the name, the Ouija board, came from the old board game, because your hands were always moving. That's how it got its name. But well, looks like this one had a little trouble. This airplane, the A3D, the largest airplane to ever fly off an aircraft carrier. We carried 5 of them on the Ticonderoga. It was an atomic bomber that was developed. The Air Force had it under the designation of B-66, and the Navy had it called the A3D. Now this airplane was so large, so big, that if you're looking at the deck here on the center line, when that airplane landed on that center line, you can see the tip of the right wing, the starboard wing, is right at the edge of that foul line we were talking about. So when that airplane came aboard and landed, you were looking almost straight up at the tip of the wing. That's how close it was to you when it came from here to here in from 130 miles an hour to 0, and you were standing there looking at it. It was quite a thrill to see that. I'm sure it was a thrill for the pilots also. They were really very brave people. But this just gives you an idea of how big that airplane was. The length of that airplane's body was the same as a B-17 bomber of World War II. Another thing about these airplanes on this deck that was interesting was when they were parked, if you had an airplane come back, say, and there was something wrong with it, it couldn't transfer fuel, the radio wasn't working, or something wasn't right on it, the pilot, when he landed, would tell the closest telephone talker to me that the airplane was down. So they would radio into me, let's say number 403 is down, and you immediately turned that airplane over and it had a red tail, so that when all the airplanes were parked again and the flight deck officer came in and he saw that red tail, he knew that that airplane had to go below decks and bring up an airplane that was working. It wasn't going to be able to be launched in the next flight. So when all the months that I was in here, one time I had a whole bunch of people talking to me in the room and a whole bunch of people talking to me on the phone at the same time, and somebody radioed in that this certain airplane was down, and I rogered it, and I got waylaid there and forgot to turn it over. So here comes all the pilots now climbing in the airplanes ready to go, and the plane captain, the pilot's going to climb in this airplane, and the plane captain says, "Sorry sir, this airplane's down." And, "Well, why is it here?" Well, I told them, not my fault, maybe even in those days, so that meant they had to pull that airplane out of spot and get it down below decks and bring up an airplane that was capable of flying, which was a delay in the flight. And it's been 60 years now since that happened, almost 60 years since that happened. I can still remember the verbal abuse in my ears, and I deserved it. I made a very bad mistake there. I can assure you that it never happened again, but there was that one time, I'll never forget it. But there was no danger to it because the airplane didn't fly, but it was danger in the fact that it held up the launch. So that was a very critical mistake.
And you also have the hangar deck below?
The hangar deck, also you had, you had guys at each elevator, and you had guys at 3 positions. So anytime airplanes were moving on the hangar deck, you were also moving these at the same time. So let's say you were bringing up this airplane, number 212, that got a red tail on it, but let's say we're bringing that airplane up. As it moved on to the elevator, the fellow down below would say that number 212 is on the elevator. As it came up to the top, now the elevator guy up here would say 212 is at flight deck level. So you brought that airplane from down below up to the deck. So it was just a constant movement of airplanes, but you were always only a few seconds behind the actual movement of the aircraft coming up. I think
Okay, so everybody was on the radio. What about this box up here, the squawk box?
Now you had about 6 or 7 different forms of communication. The one with the sound-powered phones that I was on was a separate circuit just for the people that were radioing in to me so that I could move the planes on this table. The flight deck officers and so forth in here had to have all other kinds of communication, especially in a wartime. So this one here was connected to every compartment, so forth, that was critical to the flight movement of the airplanes. Engine room, steering, the bridge, whatever it took to be in communication with somebody. That was by pushing these buttons and pressing the handle that you were able to communicate with them. Also had some other radios in here, telephones, and all along here you had more telephones. There was several different ways in case one thing got knocked out, say in a battle or whatever, there'd be another way to communicate with the rest of the ship. So that was a part of that. This graph that I have here shows by types of aircraft. I've got these different colored buttons showing the different types of aircraft that flew off the ship. And so in this mode here, it shows kind of like what I had here on the deck, all the airplanes lined up for launch. So you can see the Crusaders first and the green buttons, and the A4s and so forth, and the FJs down the side, and then the big ones, the larger airplanes, the AJ or the A3, here are the big buttons, and then back here the propeller-driven planes all ready to go. This then shows after they've landed, the last airplane that's now landed, the A3s always came aboard last. That's the last airplane in. You can see how all the other planes were stacked up in rows to stay on the opposite side of that foul line we talked about, which is right in here. So once those were all in place and that last airplane landed, as I stated, then the tractors came out and all these were moved back, and within 20 minutes or so, everything from here looked like this. That's how fast we were able to do that. This picture here shows you a sequence of World War II when everything was propeller driven. In those days, the ship could carry 110 aircraft. The reason being that all propeller-driven airplanes, the wings folded closer and tighter to the body of the plane. Once the jets came with the swept wings, you couldn't do that anymore. They took up more space, so it dropped down to we were carrying about 85 airplanes. But this shows you how dangerous it was with all those engines running, all in rows there. And I estimate, you could see a few people in here on the deck, but I estimate with this amount of airplanes here in this photograph that there's at least 130 men on that deck that you cannot see, that are either pulling chocks or dodging propellers or so forth. You can see just how dangerous what was going on, because these airplanes are creating wind and force, so forth, going back. So the next airplane coming by, the propeller's right there. You just were always that close to a bad accident, and they did happen quite a bit. So this gives you an idea of that. This airplane is showing you what could happen when a fuel tank came off an airplane. When it hit the deck, it came loose and exploded. Luckily, this pilot was able to get out of that aircraft okay.
Okay. Okay.
This was our saying here on the ship. It was usually hanging up like right here. Anyone who in the midst of all this confusion can remain calm obviously does not have a clear picture of the situation. That pretty much explained what was going on around here.
And you could be in here for hours, if not days, or?
Days, definitely. I don't know what it's like nowadays, but in those days with the Cold War and what was going on, we were on alert, general quarters all the time. It was very, very stressful. We did a few times see periscopes, and we're told that the Russians were looking at us, and Russian Bear bomber one time flying over. It was an interesting situation. We did one time launch our planes off of Formosa. I guess that was during the time Chiang Kai-shek was running into problems. But we did have a few airplanes come back with bullet holes in them that I think maybe a farmer was shooting a small gun at him or something. But we did have some problems with that, but we never actually saw any activity on the ship. Our own aircraft and our own problems were right here where there was enough safety problems as it was.
Okay. Let me just get a picture of this. And this, stand next to the carrier here, and they had the.
Now this.
Howard, go ahead.
This is a drawing, an illustration of a later aircraft carrier. The wider deck. This is almost 100 feet wider than the deck we have on the Hornet. Also, the island sitting here on this ship, the island is in here. So by putting this extension out this way, it's off to the side. This ship has more elevators. It's got 4, 2 here and 2 here. Nothing in the deck. This ship has 3 elevators, 1 in the deck. This is 240 feet longer than this USS Hornet is. We have a new aircraft carrier coming in the next year or so, the Gerald Ford. It'll be 300 feet longer than this ship. So it'll be another 60 feet longer than this one here. But this gives you an idea of a little more space. Now, originally in World War II, these carriers that were coming out had what was called a straight deck. Just the center part here was what you'd be looking at. There was no angle. So the airplanes coming aboard, if they missed the cable, they went forward and crashed into the airplanes that had already landed. It was a very poor situation. So starting in the 50s, the British were the first ones to add some space to the side, and that by doing that, they moved the deck at an angle so that the airplanes coming aboard, then if they missed the cable, they could go around again. Then in the new wave of carriers being built in the late 50s and into the 60s and from then on, they made them wider, and so they got that angled deck. Also, this ship, the Essex class type of ship, has just 2 catapults, which we looked at. The new carriers now have 2 here and 2 here also in the landing area, so they can be launching 4 airplanes where we could only launch 2. However, in our day, the amount of airplanes we could get off the deck on those 2 catapults, because it took less time to get them on the catapults, we could get as many airplanes into the air then as they can get into the air now, even with 4 catapults, because they actually steer the airplanes onto the cats now. They don't use the tilly bars anymore. Airplanes are too heavy to try and put them on with tilly bars.
Okay, go ahead and explain.
Here's another illustration of these 2 deck designs we were talking about. This is a very earlier straight deck aircraft carrier, and you can see all the airplanes are lined up here. When a plane was coming aboard, if it missed the cables, it was going to go up and crash into airplanes that were already parked. Originally in the 50s, what they did on these carriers was to add a part here, right here, and then they could make that angled deck. The newer carriers now are all being built with angled decks and much wider, so you can see now there's more room to park airplanes and so forth, and then still have that landing area. So this was some pretty hairy stuff that they were doing in those days, especially when they started to come with much larger airplanes. This is showing all propeller-driven airplanes right now, which came in slower also. The jet planes are coming in about 50 miles an hour faster than the propeller-driven airplanes.
Okay, cool. Okay, you're on, Rich.
Okay, so we're in the USS Ticonderoga room here on the USS Hornet. There are, I think, 13 rooms now that are dedicated to Essex class carriers that all were built during World War II and fought in World War II. And I volunteered to restore this room, and I didn't realize at the time when I volunteered that there was going to be over 400 artifacts that had to be cataloged so that they had it all down. And so there's some very interesting situations here. Somebody had the presence of mind to save this. The Ticonderoga was hit by 2 kamikazes in January of 1945, and it lost about several hundred men. And this is the type of airplane that hit, that was the kamikaze plane. Somebody had the presence of mind to pick up some of the pieces of the airplane and save them. And then years later, there's quite a bit of history in here, obviously. Years later, somebody did some research and sent letters and actually found one of the pilots that had been a kamikaze pilot, found the family and wrote letters and had some correspondence back from one of the pilots that had perished that day. So there's it took a lot of perseverance, I'm sure, to find that. But all of these different things all came off of people or parts of the ship through the time that it was commissioned from 1944 until it was decommissioned in 1973, I think it was. And I was on the ship from 1957 through 1959. So just basically, there's just a lot of artifacts in here that represent that. When I was all done doing the rest of the room, I built every one of these model airplanes. They're all the planes that ever flew off the ship, and painted them in the delivery of that, and have them all encased in this one glass case here. So there was quite a bit of model building going on there for a while, but this A3D, as we talked about up above, you can see how much larger it was than the rest of the aircraft. And it was quite a project to do all of this, but all of the things in here all belong to the ship at one time or another. In order to get all this up there, we decided to use these slide boards here so that we can get everything in place. And bring your camera here. This was another one of my jobs, was wearing the hot suit. Went into crashes. The thing that was bad about that, it was all asbestos. And you took that suit off and you were just had asbestos in your eyebrows, you had it everywhere, in your nostrils. Luckily it never affected me, but so far. But that was another job that I performed on the ship. Over here we've got a lot of the stuff that happened, a lot of the articles that happened. The Ticonderoga picked up the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 astronauts. A year or two after Hornet picked up Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. And so there's a lot of history on all these boards. And then over here, put another display together here of planes on the flight deck. This would be an Avenger and a Hellcat. Made the flight deck for this, and got these model planes put together. Built the cart for the torpedo and so forth. This fellow here, quite a man, Captain Dixie Kiefer. He was the captain on the ship the day that the kamikazes hit the carrier, and one of them went right into the island where he was at, and killed 5 people in the island, and he had something like 60 pieces of shrapnel stuck in him, and he was bleeding pretty bad, and they wanted him to go below to sick bay, and he refused. He kept steering the ship out of harm's way, and so they put an IV in him, and they were putting blood in him at the same time it was coming out, and they were able to save his life, get him back to the United States. And about 4 months later, he was coming back to the ship and in a routine airplane flight, and he crashed, and he was killed. So it just wasn't meant to be, but quite a hero. There's spoons here and booklets and a lot of history that's all saved, which is very nice. And these other rooms that are around the ship also that represent a lot of the carriers that were involved. It's keeping a lot of history going. It's very, very neat.
Yeah, quite a room.
I didn't want to say anything about this, but this just shows you. I didn't want to encourage more people to do stuff, but I had another guy here. So he plucked it.
Oh, really?
And then there was a pilot back here just kind of checking, and they plucked that. It just makes you wonder what's going on in somebody's mind.
Yeah. What the value people have.
Yeah.
What little value they have.
Yeah.
And things. Looking good. Let me go back. Now these were these yours, Rich? Your
What?
paintings? These are these paintings?
No, those were done by other artists. I do have that print signed by this guy is really, really good, William Phillips. This is signed by Stockdale. That he ran for president there with somebody.
Oh, yeah.
But he took off on this flight, and that's when he was shot down. He was in Hanoi Hilton for 5 years or something like that.
Pretty cool. Okay. so here is the Ouija board.
Yeah,
that
that's
was
the
here.
original Ouija board for the Ticonderoga when it was a CBS. So you're looking at aircraft that were used later on. But this board was, you know, pretty good stuff. That they would do it in stainless steel and then etch everything in place.
Good.
God, I don't have my keys with me to open this case up. I should go get it in the car and come back up. Now you can